Hi there, welcome to this text series with Silas Olga. In today's tutorial, I'll be showing you how to basically structure how to basically structure your Golang application, right? And I want to believe that for you to come this far, it simply means that you have your Golang set up already, the installation. You've got your Visual Studio Code, you've got your Postgres database. Okay, so we are going to delve right into it without wasting much of your time. So I have an empty folder opened here in my Visual Studio Code. So I'll go right into the terminal and just do go mod init. Normally there are several ways of doing this. Particularly, I would just do it this way. I just call this test01. So I'll just go mod init test01. So if you notice, it just created the go mod file for us with a module of test01, and then the go version is 1.22.2 or 1.22.2. okay, so right inside this folder, we're going to create several folders where our project structure would our code base will go into. So the first folder we're going to create here is the CMD. We're going to create a CMD folder. The next folder we're going to create is for our configurations, config. I just call it configs. You can call it configurations if you want. So here I'm going to call this internals, right? So this is like the folder that's going to contain the heart, is like the heart of our architecture and our application. Okay, so another folder I'm going to create here would be the provider. I just call this provider. So you're going to see what this folder does in a little while, or rather in a short period of time. You'll see what the folder does. And then we're going to create another folder here. We call it the X. So this is basically where all my utilities will go into. Okay, so of course we need the main file, right? main.go. So this file is responsible for our application. Okay, so what will basically come here will be our package. We'll say package main, and then we create the main function. Okay, so that is our main function here. Okay, so going further, we have to create this server. So we will be using Gin, right? We'll be using Gin to create the server. So in the CMD folder, I'm going to create another folder here. I'm going to call this server, and then inside the CMD folder still, I'll create another file, a file this time around, and call it root. I'm going to call this root.go. I just want to be sure that I didn't create it inside the server folder. So I'm going to call this a package name of CMD. We're going to push in our code very soon. So inside here, I'll create a file, and I'll just simply call this server.go. So, and I'm going to call the package name server. Okay, so that's where our server is going to go in. So the first thing we're going to do here is to define an interface. So I'm going to create an interface for the Gin server. Okay, call this an interface, right? So this interface basically is going to take all our methods, right? So we'll get to see how that is done in a short period of time. Yeah, so we'll create a Gin server builder struct. Let me call this I could call this Gin server implementation, or better still, let's call this Gin server builder, right? So let me write this in camel casing. I prefer to do it that way. So create a structure there. You're going to see shortly how we're going to utilize these. So we'll create another struct. We'll call these let's call this gene server in small letters. Okay, so this struct basically will be representing the gene server. So we're going to take in give it the engine. All right, so we're going to say gene dot engine. But before we are able to make use of gene dot engine, right, before we're able to make use of this gene package, right, you can navigate to your GitHub repository, or better still, you can come to Golang or go.dev. What's it called? Go.dev, I suppose. Then come to packages, and you get to search for, let's search for gene, for instance. You can see the package here, gene. So this is how you get to look for gene web framework. So basically it's a web framework written in Go, blah blah blah, so you get to read through this documentation. Okay, so this is the GitHub repository. Okay, so we'll go back to our project, right? So I have to import this package from Go, or import the package for the gene. So this has to be installed. That is why my Visual Studio Code is underlining it in red. So normally I like to create a make file. So make file basically allows me putting my commands here. Okay, but I'm not going to use this now, so we will use this later on, where we have so many commands to type, and we want to make life easy for us. So to install this package, I'm just going to do go mod tidy. So go mod tidy would basically yeah, finally it's now installing. All right, sometimes this is how your VS Code gets to misbehave at times, so okay. So having done this now, so the next thing we're going to do is basically now that we've established the engine, that's the engine of our server, which is the gene instance. So the next thing we're going to do is to declare the server property. So this one we're going to use HTTP. We're going to get the HTTP server. HTTP server, yeah. So it's a package, right? HTTP server package. Okay. Remember, I said that this method, basically what this does, it represents the gene server. Okay, so let me write a comment here so that you can understand what this basically does. Or it's a struct that represents the gene server. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is to create a function that would initialize our gene server. So we'll call this new gene new gene server builder. So let's call this new gene server builder. So what this will basically do, it's going to point to our interface. That's the gene server builder, the one we've created here, this struct, rather the struct I mean to say. So it's going to point to our struct, and we're going to return the gene server builder here. All right, so what it's going to return is basically going to return the gene server builder. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do would be to create a method that builds our server. So this method will basically build the gene server and return the instance. So to do that, we're going to create a function. Let's call this a builder, for instance, and then we say gene server builder, and then we'll call the method build. The method is not going to accept any parameter, so it's basically going to return the gene server. Now take note, this is the interface, so it's basically going to return the interface. Okay, so take note of that, it's very important. So let's write this in camel casing so that it's going to make more sense, right? Okay, so we can at this point say engine is equals to gene dot default. Okay, so if we open the gene documentation, you would see how basically to initialize the gene package. Yeah, but I don't just want us to copy these and paste into our main function. Okay, let's do it in a clean way, you know. So yeah, you get to like this. Okay, so here what we'll basically do is going to be a very simple method, and then we will return the gene server. Okay, so the gene server, and then it will take in the engine. Okay, so this is basically what we're going to return in our builder. So this returns a new gene server instance with the created engine. Okay, it doesn't just return it, but it returns it with the created engine we've just established. Okay, so so the next method we're going to create here basically would register the route, or better still, before we create that method, let's create a method that starts the server. So to do that, I'm going to create another method here. This one now will be gene server. We're going to point to gene server. So let's say start. So this method is going to take in the context, and then let's say context is going to take in the context. So let's say context, and it's going to also take in the HTTP address where we want to run our application. So this is going to be a string. Okay, and then this method is going to return an error. So we can now say gene server dot server is equals to HTTP dot server. Okay, and then it's going to take in two parameters, that is the address, which is the HTTP address, and then it's going to take in another parameter, which is the handler. So this is like the HTTP handler for the server. So we're going to say G server engine. Okay, that's not all. Normally I like to do a go routine here, so I'll just say go function. Okay, then in here we can now say if error is the gene server dot server dot listen and serve. Okay, so we say error if it's not equals to nil, and let's say error is not equals to HTTP dot error serve closed. Okay, if it's not equals to that, we can at this point log the errors here. So to do this, normally I prefer to make use of the log rules package. Yeah, so let's just write it here. It's going to be a package, so we're going to import this. Say log rules dot fatal f. Okay, so listening, let me put this in this is a string. Listening, so let's put these onto a new line. Okay, and then let's put the error there. So we're not done yet, so here we can just return nil, but it will make sense if we can also print a message that lets us know that our server is actually running. So we say log rules dot info, right? So we say HTTP server is running on port, so we're going to pass in the port here. So let's say it's running at port, it could be port 8080, it could be port 3000, you know, as the case may be. So this basically will let you know that it's actually running on a particular port. So remember, I told you I prefer to use the log rules instead of probably using the FMT, fatal and all of that. Yeah, so I just prefer to use this package. We haven't installed this package yet, and that's why we're getting this line in red. So to do that again, I'm just going to come here and do go mod tidy. Okay, finally it decided to pick up. Okay, so having done this, let's see what it okay, so let's info f, let's format that, let's format the message. Yeah, okay, sorry, I had to pause to take a drink. Okay, so when we start our server, it's also it makes sense that we're able to shut down the server gracefully. Okay, so to do that, let's create another method that is going to help us shut down our server gracefully. So to do that, I'm going to say gs so we say gin server. Okay, so we're going to call this shutdown. Okay, so what this method is basically going to do is going to take in the context. So we say context dot context. All right, so and then this method is going to return an error. Okay, so what we can do, let's say if error gin server dot server dot shutdown. I think the shutdown should be in capital letter. Okay, shut down the context. We can say error is not equals to, oh sorry, trying to type very fast, so I missed that. Error is not nil. If the error is not nil, let's still use our log rules. Okay, so we use a log rules dot we use fatal f, so we format since it's going to be a formatted string or formatted message. So we say server shutdown. Let's put in some errors there. So this gets to tell us what we need to know, and then we can say return nil. You might as well decide to do another log rules here dot info server is exiting or server is shutting down, whatever error message you want to you feel like putting here, so you can feel free to do all of that. So now we basically have a method that enables us start our server and shut down our server gracefully. Okay, so in here, okay, so since we've done this, let's move. Before we move out of here, let's do this in our interface. Let's define this method. So to do that, we're just simply going to do this. So we'll come to our interface and let's say start. We have the start method already, so of course it's going to take in the context. So we're going to say context dot context. It's going to take in the HTTP address. Okay, so we can basically just copy this. We can copy this and we paste it there. Yeah, so that we save ourselves the time. So let's just do this. We're just gonna copy this and we're gonna paste that here. Okay, so we have a method that builds our server. Okay, all right, so we're good to go from here. So in our root directory, we're going to create another method here. Okay, so what this method basically does is it handles the execution. So we just call this execute. So it's not going to take in any parameter. Maybe I should increase my font size a bit. Yeah, so it can look better off and a bit bigger. Okay, so let me close down these a bit. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to say builder is equals to server dot new gene server builder. So where we're getting this new gene server builder, remember we created it here. All right, so we're just importing it from there. All right, so we could now say server. So this basically creates a new instance of the gene server builder. Okay, so we can now say server is equals to the builder dot build. Okay, so now we are building a new gene server instance using the builder. Okay, so I like to do something here. So I like to get my context here. I just call this context dot background. So you're going to see the need for this later, but let me just quickly comment that out. So down here we can say okay, let's use a go routine for this. Or instead of using a go routine, yeah, let's use a go routine for this. So I could just say go function. So I'll say if error is equals to server dot start. Remember, server is taking the context, so we're gonna have context or yeah. So let's do this. It's gonna take in the context, okay, and the port. So before we specify the port, I want this to come from our environment variable. So let's come here quickly and create a new file. Let's call this app.env. So I like to do it that way. Okay, so because of this error, I don't like to see errors in my code. Okay, let's just leave it. So we'll fix this shortly. So we've created a new file called app.env here. So let's call this app port. Normally is recommended you do 0.0 port. 8080. That simply tells us that it's running on localhost, but localhost port 8080. Okay, so most times I prefer to write it this way. So I can now come into my config folder, okay, and create a new file within the config folder. I'll call this, okay, I like to do it this way. I call one method constants.go. Let's put a package here, config. Okay, I'm going to create another method. I'm going to call this one config.root, and then the package is also going to be config. So basically what I do in the constants, right, I just define my constants for the application here, like the ones I just added here. Okay, so I don't get to write ports everywhere. So inside the constant folder, I'm just gonna do constant I call these app port. What did we name it? We called it app port. So I'm just going to copy that into the constant and then put it right there. So you can have stuff like app name, okay, if you want to, right? It's not compulsory, so I'm just gonna leave that blank. Eventually we're going to have stuff like database URL, okay, and stuff like that. Okay, so okay, so I've declared my constant here. So in the config folder now, or sorry, in the config file, we're going to have a basic setup here. So the first method I usually like to write is the load configurations, or better still, let's call this load env. Let's call it load environment. Okay, so inside the load environment folder, we're going to make use of a package go.env. So let's check it out. Go.env. So this is a package we're going to use to handle our environment variables, and this is how to use it. Okay, I don't want us going to copy just this example and pasting it in our what's it called, in our main file. So let's keep things simple, right, so that we can have a smarter code base to work with. Okay, so I had to take a drink. Okay, so with this example here, oh sorry, I just closed that. So with this example in the documentation right here, we can do this. We can say if error go .env .load. Take note, we named our env file as app.env, so I'm going to name this as app.env, and then let's say if error is not nil, that means if there's an error, it should tell us what am I writing? It should tell us log rules dot fatal error loading .env file. Okay, so having done this, we need to install this package, and to do that we write our go mod tidy. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is come back to the root. So right here we can just say config dot load environment variable. So we imported config. So we imported these, right? So we'll just say config dot load environment variables, right? So here we can now say os dot get env. Okay, most times I forget how this thing is written because there are several packages you can use, okay, to manage environment variables. There are several of them, right? So we can just call config dot app port. Remember, we created that config, that constant here, app port. Okay, and then this is coming from our environment variable, which we named as app port. Okay, so having done this, so right in here, so we're not done. Let's say if error is not new, so let's log rules. Let's log our error. Let's say error format. Let's format the errors. Error starting, let's say error starting the server. Okay, so let's put our error in there. Okay, so I needed to import the context. Okay, so here we are. So before this runs, let's block this until the context is done. Okay, until probably there's a signal that, okay, I want to stop the server, or I want the server to stop. Okay, so to do that, we can just do this. So let's say context. I wrote it as context. So let's say context dot done. Okay, so now let's log. Bear with me. Let's say server stopped here. Okay, that's not all. So let's create a context with a timeout here for shutting down the server. So to do that, we can just say shutdown. Let's say cancel will be equals to I can do ctx dot no, let me just write the context, right? Context dot with timeout, then let's say context the background, right? And then let's say let's give it let's say 5 yeah, let's say 5 times seconds. Let's use seconds, right? So we can now defer, sorry, let's do this. Let's defer cancel. Okay, so what this basically does is it ensures that the cancel function is called, okay, to release resources when it is done. Okay, so what we can now do, we can now say if, let's say if error, remember we had a method that gracefully shuts down our server, which we created earlier, method that was it shut down server, sorry, this is equals to server dot shutdown. This method, when we created it, it requests for a context. Remember this context we are playing with here, so let me just write this in full. Let's call this shutdown context so that it's going to make some sense here. So we'll just say shutdown context, and then let's say error if it's not equals to nil, right? So let's say log rules that let's say error f, and then there was an error stopping the server, or error shutting down the server, whatever message makes sense. Okay, since we want to use a formatted this thing here, so we can just make it formatted. Okay, so yeah, we've written quite a lot. So this is a cleaner way of setting up your gene server. So now it becomes easier for us in our method to just say cmd dot execute. You see this? So we keep our code base very clean. So now let's run this server. Let's run this and see what we have here. So we can now say go run main.go. Yes, wonderful. So we've got our server running on port 8080. Wow, this is marvelous. Okay, we've done great. So the next thing we're going to do now, after setting up our server, there are a few things missing here. Okay, I can just kill the server. So the next thing we're going to do is to move into the internals. So in the internals folder, yeah, we're going to create a new folder. We'll call this a handler. Inside here, we'll create another one. We'll call this the model. So inside here, we'll create another one. We'll call this the repository. I hope I spelled that correctly. So inside here, we'll have another one. We'll call it the services, and then we're gonna have another one. Let's call it the services handler model route services. Okay, we can create another one here. We could call this the route. Okay, so we're going to put all our routes in there. So if you have a very big application structure, it's best to separate components so that you can, or separate concerns, as rightly put. Yeah, I had to pause to take a drink. Okay, so back to this. Let's start from our model. So we are definitely going to need a database. So what we want to do now is to create two RESTful endpoints, one that will register a user and the other one that will retrieve a user. So that means we're going to have two endpoints, the post with a post and a get request. Okay, so to do this, we're going to use GORM, GORM. So let's look at it. So let's go to packages. Let's search for GORM. So we're going to use this package called GORM. Okay, so let's check out the GitHub repository. Okay, so we're going to use this package. So to do this, let's come back to our config folder. We need to do some configurations here. So inside the config, let's look for a way to create. Oh no, before we do this, let's create a database, an actual database, right? So we can use our database to play around with some commands. Okay, so usually I use Docker. Okay, and I'm going to pull out the Docker Alpine to create the database. And to do that, I need to be sure that my Docker is up and running. So let me check it out. So I need to be sure this is my Docker desktop application here. I just opened this up. So Docker desktop is running. Okay, so I just started this. So let's just use Docker here to create the database, and then I'm going to use what's it called, the PG admin, Postgres admin, to be able to manage the database. Okay, so let's use Docker to do that. We can do this. So let's, if you've got, I believe by now you've got Docker installed, so you can check the procedures for installing Docker, or if you have another instance of the Postgres database running, that's marvelous. You can make use of it. So I'm going to say Docker run name. I'm going to call database test01, test01. So it's going to run on port 5432, 5432. Postgres, let me write this in caps lock. Postgres user is going to be test01 user. I'm going to call it test01 user, and then another e flag, Postgres password. I'm going to call these test01 password. Okay, another e flag, Postgres DB. I want to be sure that I'm writing the commands correctly. Most times I get to put double S. Okay, so I'm gonna call these test01. That's gonna be the name of database. So I'm gonna say Postgres 16. I'm gonna use 16, and then I'll pull the Alpine. Okay. Oh, this is wonderful. So our database instance is running. So usually I prefer to start it off from the Docker desktop application. So I'm going to just go to dashboard, open it up here, and yeah, here it is. It's running. So I'm going to kill it from the command line. I just type Ctrl C and make sure that it's running on the dashboard. Yeah, so I'll just start the instance from here. Okay, all right, so having done this, the next thing we're going to do is to connect our database. So in the env file, we're going to have database URL. So we're going to have database URL, and then this is going to be equals to Postgres. So we're going to say test01 user. That's the username we created earlier, and then we're going to have test01 password at localhost, and it's running on port 5432, and the name of the database is test01. Okay, so this is how we get to connect to a database using the database URL. So I'll quickly come to my constants and include this variable there. So I'll just add it in my constants. Okay, so in the config file now, we're going to create a function, and then let's call this setup database. Let's say setup database, and this function is going to take, or it's going to return GORM to us, GORM.db. Okay, it's going to return GORM.db, and it's going to also return an error to us. Okay, all right, so how do we go about this? We need this to set up our Postgres database. So to do this, let's call this let's say dsn is equals to os dot get env, sorry, and then let's say database URL. So we don't need to call config.database URL because we already have config here. So we just say database URL. So what we will do here, we will now open the connection to the database using GORM with the Postgres driver. So let me show you quickly. So if we come to GORM, I think I like to use their website most times. Okay, gorm.io.docs. You can see here connecting to database here. So the instructions are here. So there's a driver for MySQL. There's a driver for Postgres. Yeah, so we're going to need these. Okay, we're going to definitely need these two. So you can see how it is done right here. Okay. Okay, so using this example now, what we're just going to do is in here now that we have seen how it's done, let's come back here. So it basically returns the DB and the error to us. So we're going to come back here and say DB an error is equals to GORM that open. So we say Postgres dot open. What is it opening? This DSN is going to open this up. Okay, is that all? So let's see. Postgres does open DSN, and then it's going to take in the GORM configurations. Okay, so we're just going to do this in here, and we're going to say GORM dot config. Okay, so we can now say if, I'm writing this in capital letter, so I'm going to say if error is not equals to nil, we are going to at this point return nil and an error. So let's use fmt here. Let's use fmt that to format that error. So let's write a message and say error connecting to the database. So what's the error? We're going to do this and print out the error there. So remember, we're to return two things here. That's database connection and the error. So we're going to just return DB and nil. That means there was no error whatsoever. So yeah, this is how to create a connection to our database. So we've not installed these packages yet, but we just added them. That's the driver for Postgres and the GORM. So to do that, we can come down here and do go mod tidy. Okay, so I think I didn't save this. All right, so okay, create a method here and say load config, but let's not do that. Let's come to CMD and dump in our code in there. So you can do this in a neater way. Yeah, it depends on how you want to, handle your code base. So I'm just going to do this config dot setup database. Okay, so we're expecting a database here and an error from there. Okay, so we won't be using this now, so I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to say if error is not equals to nil. So here I can now use my log rules just so as to have formatted errors, looking nice kind of errors. You get errors setting of database. So let's put in the error here. Let's put in the error there. So here we can now see there was an error setting up the database. Okay, so this looks cleaner. My screen is looking quite big. All right, so yeah, this looks clean. So let's check if our server is still running or can still run. So let's say go run main.go. So you can see that this commands I'm writing is quite repeated. So let me look for a way to simplify this. So in this make file we created, I could just do tidy here and then say go mod, sorry, I'll just say go mod tidy, and then run. I could say go run main.go, and then I create a funny as a tidy. Create a funny as a tidy and run. Okay, so we can now come back to our server. You can see our server is still running, and there was no error whatsoever connecting to our database. So we did a good job here, connecting to our database and all. Okay, so in our internals folder, we have the handler model repository route services. So in the models folder, let's start from here. Let's say we have user.model.go. So let's create a package for our model. Okay, so in this package we're going to say so basically we want to create a user, a database that holds a user and retrieves the data for us. So let's create a type. Let's call this user struct. Let's use our GORM.model. So what this does is to ensure that things like updated ads, created ad, deleted ad, it gets to import those for us. So if you don't include these, then those might not really take effect. So I love to do this ID. I like to make this a UUID dot UUID. So yeah, there's a package called Google UUID, but there is another one I like to use from I think FRS, Go FRS. So I I like to use that. So let's save these, and we can open another terminal and just go to make tidy. So I can do this. I just say gum. Is going to be a type of UUID, and then it's going to be a primary key, and then the default value, let's say UUID underscore generate underscore v4, right? So this is definitely going to generate UUID GORM. Okay, we're making a mistake here. Just want to be sure. So we'll wrap this in double quotes. Yes, type UUID semicolon primary key. Okay, semicolon default UUID underscore generate v4. Okay, that's fine. So the next thing we're going to have is an email. So the email is going to be a string, and we're going to say gum, and we're going to make this unique, and it's not going to be null, not null. So the next thing is going to be username. It's going to be a string. It's going to be a string. Let's say gum. Okay. I think I could just copy these so I don't get to repeat all of these. Username, and then we're gonna have let's say full name. I love to use camel casing. I'm gonna paste that in again. So full name doesn't necessarily have to be unique. We can just say it's not null, and then let's just do something nice here. Let's say user role. It tells us if this person is an admin or not. So one thing we can easily do here, right, which I love to do most times, I could just define a type of role and say string, and then in here I could just create a constant and say admin role. It will now be of type role. Okay, and then I could just call this admin. Okay, and user role. So you see, so now this user role user role will now be of type role. Okay, let me copy these. Okay, and I just give this a default value of user. So we're just gonna put in user there. Okay, so we have created a simple database struct model. So now we need to run this. So if you come to just a second, if you come to your server, okay, we don't have this running here. So this is a pgadmin 4. It's just a UI interface that allows you manage database servers. So let's create one. Let's register a server here. So let's call this test 01. Connection is to the local host. Of course, it's running on post 432. The database name we created was what was the name again? Let's look at it. Database name is username is test01 user. So I'm just gonna say username test01 user, password is test01 password. I'm gonna save this. Database name is test01. Okay, so I could just create a connection. Voila, this worked. So if we open this now, you can see the database here, test01. If you check critically in the tables, you realize that there is no database here. So what we can do, again, okay, so let's run a migration so that we can see the table, the user table we just created in our model here. So we're going to see a table with this data. Okay, so to do this, let's go back to the configurations we had earlier and create another method. I like to do it this way. I just call this load or let's do it neater. Let's say auto migrate. Okay, so let's just add a nice word here. Let's say run auto migration. I think this makes more sense. So what this method is going to take is going to take in the database connectivity from GORM. Okay, and then let it give us an error. Let it tell us if there's an error or not. Okay, so what we can just simply do is if error, again we can check the documentation for details of how to handle migrations and all, right? You can feel free to run a search, feel free to familiarize yourself with this. So back to here, we can now say if error is equals to db, so we're sending in db here. So let's say db dot auto migrate. So in here we can now call model dot user. So the user we created here, that's what we're calling here. So we can now say model dot user. Okay, so let's say if error is not equals to nil, okay, error is not equals to nil, we can just let's say error, let's format this error message. Let's say fmt dot sprintf error migrating database. Okay, so here we can just return, let's say errors.new error message. Let's also, the reason I formatted that in there was to lock the error. Error message. Okay, so we're not done here. So at this point, we'll just return nil, which is to say for it to get through to this point, there was no error. So whatever migrations we're going to have will all be repeated here. So let's come back here and let's save this. Let's restart this server. Go run main.go. Okay, there was no error. Okay, pardon me. Before doing that, I need to run the migration here. So let's say if error, let's call this method right here. Okay, so let's say run auto migration. It's gonna take in the db, and then let's say if error is not equals to nil, we can return let's return nil here, and then let's format this error. Let's say error.fmt, error running migration. Okay, so since we now call this method in here, we can close this, restart our server to see, oh yeah, there was an error. And what is the error? Let's check this out. Create table uses, okay, generate v4. So what this does, it's a method that just automatically increments the UUIDs of the user. So when you're creating a user, you don't need to actually key in the user ID. The system will automatically generate that. Okay, since we are already using pgadmin, we can just quickly do it from here. So let's open up pgadmin and just navigate to test01. I just right click and come to, on the database, right click on the database, come to extension, have a drop down, look for, I'm going to look for UUID OSSP, and I save this. So that is all we need to do. So we run this again. It should fix our problem for us. Voila, yeah, it did fix the problem for us. So our database server is up and running, which makes a lot of sense here. Okay, so to confirm this, so now let's see if we've got a table here. So we just refresh this. Yeah, we've got our table. So you can see it has created a table for us. Created that, updated that, deleted that, email, username, full name, user role. These fields were added because of the inclusion of these. Very simple and very easy. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about briefly is to see how we can now create those endpoints. Okay, so now that we have a model folder, let's create a repository where we get to relate with the model. So we're just going to call this user repository go, and the package name is going to be repository. So we're going to create a user repository here. It's going to be an interface. So this interface, of course, by now you should know what interfaces basically do in a pattern like this. We're going to see how we're going to utilize it. So we can say type user repository, but this time around we're going to use a lower cap, since it's going to be a struct that we'll use internally. Okay, so the struct is just going to implement the user repository interface. So that's just what it's going to do. So this struct is going to take in a database. So we say GORM. Oops, was I writing? No, I say GORM dot, oops, I'm writing GORM dot db. So it's going to take in GORM.db. So let's create a new function. So the new function basically will create a new user repository instance for us. So what we're going to do here is going to say new user repository. So this is going to take in the DB. So we're going to say GORM.db. Okay, so user repository. So we're going to use the interface. Okay, and then it's going to return, of course, by now you should know it's going to return the user repository. So that is going to be return user repository db. Okay, so now let's create a function that is going to save a user to the database. To save or to create a user, as the case may be. So we're going to say a function. Let me use R to represent these. User repository. Let's say create. Let's say create user account. So this is going to take in some parameters. And what are the parameters? Email, username, full name, okay, and probably role. So it's always good to keep things cleaner. So in here, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call these interfaces, and I'll add an X to it. I just love to do it that way, you know. So so in here, and now I'm going to create a new file and call this interfaces.go. So and the package is going to be interfacesx.go. So we can do here, what we can do here is just basically to create a new type of user registration request, and it's going to be a type of struct. So it's going to be a type of struct, and then we're going to say email is going to be a string, and JSON we say email. We're going to add in some validation here. Let's say validate. It's required. So you must give us an email. Okay, and it's going to be a type of email. You must give us an email to be able to register as a user. So another one will be full name of type string. I'm just going to copy these so I don't repeat myself too often. JSON representation is going to be so I want that to be the JSON representation. Full name definitely is not going to be of type email, but I want it to also be required. We're looking at full name, username, email. Okay, so so back to interfaces. So full name, username of type string, I'm just going to paste that in. So the validation here, username, what do we say? Is it required? Yeah, let's say username is required. We'll definitely need your username, and the JSON representation will be of type username. Okay, yeah, so basically I think we need just this to create a user account. So email, username, full name. The user role, we can dynamically assign that on our backend. So we've created user registration request here. So what we can now do is to come back to the repository, and then let's say user request will now point to oops interfaces. Oops, what's happening? Yeah, okay, interfaces dot user registration. So what this is going to basically return for us will be let's say it's going to return for us model dot user and then an error. Okay, so this is going to return the user details and the error. All right, so we are getting there. So we can now say here that user is equals to model dot user. So email would be user request dot email. Username would be user request dot username. Full name would be user request dot full name. User role, here we can just say model dot or let's use the user role, model dot user role, right? The model we created here earlier, remember? So model, admin role, user role. So it's just basically going to assign these values here. So that's what we're doing here. So now we can now say if error repository, that's the arrow here, because we're getting our database connectivity from here. So we can now say arrow dot db dot create. Okay, and what are we creating? This user. Okay, so dot error. So if the error is not equals to nil, then we can just return nil and the error. Otherwise, we simply return the user, okay, nil. Okay, so I think this makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we're going to test this out, but before we leave here, let us quickly create another function that will take or return the user for us. Let's say user repository, this function fetch user details. This function will just basically accept a parameter. So let's just say the email or user email. It could be the ID, it could be anything else you want to use, and it's just going to be of type string, and it's going to return these same parameters for us. Let's use these same parameters. Okay, so what we can do at this point is to say user is equals to the model user. Okay, and then let's say if error, let me give these some breathing space, arrow.db dot where email is equals to, all right, user email, which equals to user email dot first user. dot error. So let's say if error is not equals to nil, so here we'll return nil and the error. Otherwise, we return the model, which is the user here, and we say no error. So good. So now we've created two methods. Method to return user credentials. So what we can now do, remember, we have an interface, is to call these methods inside our interface so that they become accessible when beckoned upon. Okay, so now we have created a user repository. So the next thing we're going to quickly do is to create our services. So here we'll create a new file and call this user.services.go, and then this is going to be a package of services. Okay, so in this package we're still going to do a clean struct. So what this user service struct basically is going to take in the user repo. So let's say repository dot user repository. So from this repository we created earlier, so we're just going to import it here. Okay, so let's create a new user service instance, right, with a given repository. All right, so you can have several repositories as the case may be, but since we're using just one repository for now, yeah, so we're going to just create a new user service. So in this new user service, so we're going to take in the user repo. So we'll say repository dot user repository. So it's going to user service, and then here we'll return, of course we'll make use of this small guy, and then we say permit me to do this, user repo will be equals to the user repo. Okay, all right, so what we can now do next is to create a function to actually create the user. So let's call these US. So I'm going to call this guy user service create user account. Already we had defined a method here that accepts this as a request, and we also threw in some validation in here, right? So let's just put that here, so which means whoever it is that wants to utilize this endpoint has to return a user. So at this point, let us also format the data we would return to the user. So this is our request body. So here in the interfaces, let's just call this type user data struct. So here we're going to return stuff like the ID string. So let's say the JSON data would basically be of type ID. Okay, or instead of ID, let's use UUID dot UUID. Okay, and then we're going to take it, it's going to also return the email, which is of type string. I'm going to copy these because I don't want to repeat myself. Of type email, username is going to be of type string. The JSON format will be username, and then full name is going to of type string. Full name of type string, and then the JSON format is going to be full name, and then we're also going to return the user role of type model.role, right? So we'll call these, let's just call it role. And then we're also going to return stuff like dates created. Let's see what the database calls it. Created at, yeah, so let's call it created at. Created at of time, JSON format. Let me, oh, okay, I think I made a mistake here. So this is going to be of time dot time, yeah. So we're going to return these. So this is going to be just created at. Okay, so so here we're going to return interfaces, user data, and then we'll also return an error. So we need a comma there. Okay, so having done this now, so let's just say user data error will be equals to user service dot user repository dot create user account. And remember, this is going to take in the create user request, and then we can say if error is not equals to nil, we can return a nil error here, and then we return, we got a lot of space here, we return two things here, which is this. So we're just going to say user data and nil. So this now will have ID, user data.id. We can have something like I just want to do this in full so that you understand how this is done, but there are smarter ways you can handle this. Full name, email, user data.email, which other one do we have? Username, user data.username, and the role, user role. You've got user data user role, created at, yeah, created at. You've got user data created at. Okay, so this simplifies it. very easy. So let's create another method here. So basically, let's just write a comment here, this method to create user. Okay, so we can now create another method here to fetch user. So permit me to just do a copy paste. So I just say fetch user account. Okay, so we can now just simply say user data error is equals to us.user repository dot what's it called, fetch user details, and this is going to take in a string user request, or let's call it user email. So it's just going to take in the user email, right? So let's say if error is not equals to nil. Okay, so we're going to return nil and the error. Otherwise, we'll return, we can just grab this guy and paste there. So yeah, we're good. So we've got two endpoints now, one to create a user and the other one to fetch a user or fetch user details. So very simple and straightforward. So the next thing we're going to do is to include these in our interfaces. Why we're doing this is so that we can easily call them as when we need them. So I can Control C, I can go run main go, so everything still runs properly as expected. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is to come into our handlers now and just say user.handler.go. So create a package here and call it handler. Okay, so in the handler, this is where we get to return data to our users. But before we do it, okay, let's just go ahead to do this. So let's do type user handler struct. Here we won't be needing the interface. So now this user handler is going to take in two parameters. One of them will be user service. So we need that user service, the one we created earlier, and that's coming from the services package dot user service. And then we're going to need to handle a bit of validation here, so we can just say validate. There's a package I like to use from the playground. It's okay, let me just write it down. Let's see if this guy is going to pull it out for us. Validator dot validate. Okay, it didn't get this right. Okay, I think I didn't get that right. So so this is going to come from github.com/go playground /validator. So let's just check this out. Let's check this out quickly. I'm pasting the GitHub repository there. So okay, let's do go get. This is one way to get packages. It's like I didn't tell you about these earlier, so you can just do go get. Okay, let's say new user handler. So our new user handler is going to take in the user service. It's going to take in the user service, right? And then we say services dot user service, and it's going to point to the user handler. User handler, and it's going to return user handler. So we're going to have the user service, and we're going to have the validate, and we'll say validator dot new. Okay, so at this point now we can run a make tidy. It should fetch that validator for us. Okay, I think I made a mistake there. So capital V validator.validate. Okay, so having done this, the next thing we're going to do is to create a function. We'll say handler. I use H to depict that, and I'll say user handler. User handler, let's say create user is going to take in the context, the gene context, gene dot context. Okay, it's going to take in gene dot context, and we are expecting some information. So let's say variable user request, and we're expecting it to come from interfaces, interfaces x dot user registration request. So the next line of code is basically now to bind the JSON request body to the user request struct, which we just defined and call in from here. So to do that, we'll just basically do this. Let's say if error is equals to c dot should bind JSON. I think it should be to bind JSON, yes. And then what are we binding it to? User request. And then we can now say error is not equals to nil. And if there's an error here, we could just say c dot JSON. Let's use http dot status. Let's use status bad request. Let's say status bad request, and then let's format our error messages. So we can come back to here interfaces and say type. I like to do this to keep my code clean. Error message. So we've got the JSON of type message, and then let's return a code of type int JSON data of type code, and maybe we can do something like status status response. Let's do something like this. Let's define a type response status. Let's call it a string, and here we can just declare constant and say status sources. Status sources now would be this. Let's call these sources, and then we can have something like status error of type response code, and then let's call this error. All right, so we can basically now say this status is going to be of type this, and the JSON data would be of type status. Okay. Struct field type JSON not compatible with reflect struct type. Okay, so yeah, we missed the double quote at the end there. So in here I can now say interfaces error message. So let's say message error. The code will now be we can say interfaces dot sorry, not that. So we can say interfaces dot status error. Right, let's see what we're looking at. Response status. So what's the problem? Sorry, there should be status, then the code. Here we can also return HTTP the status code, and then I could just throw in a return statement there, and then I could say if error is equals to hash dot, let's validate the input struct. So after binding it, we're validating it. If it's not equals to nil, okay, so let's copy this. So here we can still use status code of bad request, and yeah, of course we pass in the error, and then if the validation is successful, don't forget we still need to do our return statement there. We can now say user data error is equals to hash, that's a user handler, a user service dot create user account. And what are we passing in? Passing in the user request. Okay, and that's how we're sending it in. So let's say if error is not equals to nil, of course we still need to throw in a JSON response, so we can do status we might not use status internal server error. Okay, so and then we throw in a return statement there, else we'll use this, and then but we won't be sending an error message. So let's create a type user response struct, so we can throw in this here, and then we can say data of type user data. Okay, of type user data. So we're going to pass in use this data in here just to have a nice formatting. Okay, so let's just copy this user response. Just want to be sure I'm not repeating each of these. So I could say here, this is going to be user response, and data will be of type user data. So okay, so at this point we've been able to create a user function here that handles creating of users. So what we need to do now is come to our routes folder and then register the route. So let me open route and create, let's just call this route. Oops, this is I did everything in capital letters, so permit me to just change this. Routes.go. But before we do anything here, we need to find a way to register this route in our root directory. So to do this, let's go back to server folder. We can do something interesting here. Okay, so in the server folder, let's create a method to register a single route and a method to group the route. So we're going to do two things: one method to register a single route and another method to group the route. We might not use it now, but subsequently you might, maybe in your personal project, find a need for it. So now let's say method to register a single route. So to do this now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say function gs gene server, say gene server, let's say register route. So this is going to take in a method. It's going to also take in the path, which are all strings, and then it's going to take in a handler that is a gene dot handle function. So it's going to take in gene handle function. So now let's we can do this switch. What's happening? Switch. So switch here, we're going to take in the method, and then the case, of course, we have the get request. We can say gene server dot engine dot get, and it's going to get the path and the method. Oh, sorry, not the method, the handler, I mean to say. So another case, so let me just copy this so we don't so we've got a case of get, post, you've got something like put, you've got the delete, you've got patch. Okay, so feel free to add any other one. So default case we can say log rules. We can say log rules dot error f, let's say invalid http method Okay, so this basically allows us to register a single route with the given method, the path, and the handler. Okay, so now let's create another method that groups our route. So when we talk about grouping, sometimes you could have stuff like API.API/user/register. You could have API /user/sign up. Okay, so you can see here that we can actually group these endpoint. So to do this, so let's create another method that's gonna do that for us. So I'm just gonna copy these just to rename the function register. I'm gonna call this register group routes. So now having a group route also can or will require stuff like middleware. Okay, so we're gonna take in few things. No need clearing a whole lot of stuff here. So we're gonna take in the path, and then we're gonna take in the route of no, we're gonna take in route definitions. Route definitions. Here we're going to have something like path, method, and handler. So to do this, let's quickly just create an interface for this. All right, it's good to always keep your code clean. So let's do type, let's say route definition of type struct. Okay, so it's going to take in the path of type string. Okay, it's going to take in the method of type string, and it's going to take in a handler of type gene. Oh, it's going to take in a handler of type gene dot handle function. Okay, so now we can come back here in our server and say routes would be a list of interfaces dot route definition. So we're also going to have stuff like our middlewares, right? Middlewares are basically stuff like authentication, checker, token verification, and stuff like that. So we're going to call these gene dot handle function. So we can have several middlewares there. So we can now say the group will be gs.engine dot group. So what is it going to group? It's going to group the path we provide. Okay, and then we can now say group dot use middlewares. So let's run a for loop here. Let's say for route in the range of routes, right? We declare our switch case here. So permit me to just do this. I'm going to copy this. Let me copy all the way to the switch case. But we're going to change some things here. But here it will now be route dot it will now be route dot met. What's that? It will now be route dot method get. So here it will now be group dot get, and then it's going to be route dot path, and it's going to be route.handler. So this is what we're going to get going forward. So group.post. Here we're going to have group.put. We're going to have group.delete, and we're going to have group.patch. Okay. Yo, very nice one we've done here. So with this now, we can proceed to registering our route. So how do we do that? So we're going to go into the route folder we just created, and just let's just say function register user routes. Okay, so we can now say server dot gin server. Okay, we're going to take in the user handler, which is this function, this handler function we've created here. So we're going to take in the user handler here. So we're going to point to handler. We're going to say handler dot user handler. Okay, so here we can just say server dot register group route. So what will be the part here? We can say API /v1 /user. Okay, it's going to handle interface is x dot route definition. Okay, and then in between here we have another method, a function, which is going to take care of our middlewares. So we can say gin dot context. Okay, and let's do a log here so we can see info. Let's format these and say request on, let's grab the route. So let's say c.request url. I think it's I don't know if I'm getting this right. url.path is I think there should be a method like this. Let's just, okay, here. So this works. Okay, so in here now, all we just need to do is we can now say method to create a user is a post method, and then the path, we can say the path is /register, and then the handler is we can say is user handler dot create user. This is interesting. Okay, so having done this, we can now come over here in our provider. Let's create a new file here and call this provider.go. So, and the package is going to be provider. So what this is going to do is basically going to say new provider is going to take in the database instance. Let's say GORM.db. It's also going to take in the server instance. So let's say server dot origin server. Okay, so here we can now say server, or better still, let's just say user repo is equals to repository dot new user repository, which is going to take in the DB, and then we say user service is going to be equals to services dot new user service, which will take in the user repo. Okay, and then the user handler now will take in the handler dot new user handler, and it's going to take in the user services. Then finally we will now have routes what did we call this? Okay, we call it routes. So finally we can say routes dot register, no, what's it, register group route, register user route. Yeah, so we call it register user route, which is taking two parameters, the server and the handler. So which is the server here, so we've got the server and the user handler. Let's write this in full. Yeah, user handler. So I've got to import this route. So we can now say test o1 /internal /route. Okay, so as simple as this is, okay, I think we've got an error here. Why is that? Okay, that's sorted. So in the root folder, before we instantiate this, we can now say provider dot new provider, and what is it taking in? The database. So at this point now we can uncomment this and then pass in, it's not just the database. I think it's taking more than, okay, the first parameter is the database and the second one is the server. Okay, so here we go. We now have a fine API. So I can now over here and do make run. Okay, we've got an error, syntax error, unexpected new line, incomplete, possibly missing comma, or okay, so where is that in our routes? Okay, so with this now we can another error, undefined type server that has no field of method, register group route. Okay, so we define this method here, but we didn't register it. So I'm going to copy this to our interface, and there we go, we added there. And then the other method we also created, the single one, the one for registering single routes, we need to also add it there. So this perfectly suits our case. Address already in use. Okay, so we already have the server in use, so I'm going to queue that instance and then run again. Okay, our API is running very fine. So the next thing I want us to do is let's test this API to be sure that we have something running or that we've done a good job. let's just say http localhost port 8080 / API / v1 / user / register. Let's look at that again. So we've got an 8080. We grouped our route to API, okay, / v1 / user / register. And in the body, let's use the raw format JSON. We're expecting okay, it's let me fetch these out. User register. Okay, we have email, full name, email, full name, and username. So we've got email, we've got email, we've got full name, and we've got username. Let's say Silas. So email, we'll say silasauger2 at gmail.com. Full name, I'll say silasauger. And then if I hit enter, okay, I get 404 page not found. Okay. Our endpoint is running successfully, user registration, but we're not supposed to show 500 internal error, but we are supposed to show maybe 200, right? To let our users know that or an okay response. So we can come to here, the handler, and yeah, so this is where we should change status okay. Okay, so we can just easily see the data in our database. Even all data is here in our database. We can delete this. When we go back to Postman, we hit this. Okay, we need to close this, rerun it, and when we go back to Postman and we hit OK, we should have an OK status of OK 200. That means API is working as expected. So we can save these in our documentation. We call these register. We just call it register, and then at the get endpoint to retrieve a user. To do that, it's very easy and straightforward. So this is the end of this tutorial. So I just basically wanted to show you how you can structure your production ready APIs, RESTful APIs. Okay, so I'm going to push the code base to GitHub and take care. Bye bye.